Hello. I haven't done a live video, I think, in a hot minute. Um, Rarely do I share my thoughts, I think, as openly as I used to. But I have been thinking a lot about silence and pain, and it mainly has to do with a kind of a shift in my thinking, a kind of radical shift, I'd say. Um, Well, maybe not perhaps too much of a radical shift, but uh, I can see there's been a progressive development in my thought. Um, One is I was getting really into pessimism, and I was reading a lot of books about pessimism. I read like Schopenhauer's, book on suffering in the world. I read Thomas Ligotti's work. Um, I already forgot what it's titled, but Thomas Ligotti is usually a novel writer, horror fiction novel writer, um, short stories particularly. But he wrote a book, um, and it's really a good. I mean, I love the book. It was a really good pessimistic kind of uh, calling, basically. And then, of course, I was reading Nietzsche for a while as well. I call that also part of a kind of pessimistic turn. I think Nietzsche would call it strong pessimism. His work was, I think he even called it that, a strong pessimism. Um, but and then also Julie Resch's work. But what I've noticed about pessimism is that there's still something quite the same about. There's something I think there's a layer of pessimism that is very similar to optimism, and that layer has a kind of focus on the self, essentially. Like what I've noticed about pessimistic philosophies is they have a really obsessed focus on suffering, despair, melancholia, you know, um, and what it does to the self. Um, and then optimism kind of does this weird maneuver where it essentially tries to propel itself into the future, but still with a fixation on the self. So basically both philosophies, no matter the variations I've noticed, is that there's still a fixation on the self in relation to suffering. Whether it be optimistic or not, it's always on the self in relation to suffering and despair and sadness. Um, and so when I got into reading Marion Milner, she made me realize, specifically her book, A Life of One's Own, she made me realize that we don't know how to have a kind of attention to forget ourselves. Um, and that really opened my mind, because I believe even what's his name? He's also Emile Cioran. Was also He's definitely a very pessimistic philosopher as well. But Emile Cioran eventually gets to the point of like what you might call like indifference, a kind of negativity of indifference. But I'd say he gets very close to this part of self-forgetting. I do think he even says like the best death for him would be to forget, which is ironic because he does end up with Alzheimer's, I believe. Uh, so this capacity to forget is very interesting. Um, and when I started diving into mystics again, particularly I've been reading like Thomas Merton, um, and I noticed that really mysticism, what we might call mysticism, has more to do with a kind of shifting of perception. And this shifting of perception has something to do with also with forgetting oneself. How do you forget yourself? Um, and it has to do, and the only way to forget oneself is a kind of praxis of attention, of the way you attend to things and other beings. So that has been the fundamental shift, and this is why I've been more interested in silence. I think I've been practicing uh, a technique by Thomas Keating called the centering prayer. Cynthia Bourgeois, I think her name is Bourgeois, Bourgeot. Yeah, Cynthia Bourgeot, not Bourgeois. Cynthia Bourgeot is also an advocate of centering prayer. And centering prayer is essentially similar to like meditation, except there's a slight shift. It has a more Christian orientation to it, meaning that it's very kenotic. It's very centered on kenosis, emptying the self. So you essentially practice letting go, whereas more stereotypical Buddhist meditation is kind of one pointed attention, right? Your attention is focused on a very particular, it's again one pointed, you only have one object of focus. Where the object of focus in centering prayer is actually the letting go of when you have thoughts, right? So this is a bit like, this may sound like, that Thomas Keating and Cynthia Bourgeois is they're being like very nitpicky about the emphasis, but I actually think this emphasis matters, um, because although in Buddhism thoughts are something that you shouldn't immediately get rid of, there's something you should watch, right? Like sort of witness them and then go back to your one pointed attention, right? Um, the interesting thing about the centering prayer is that there is no one pointed attention to go to. It's about having an objectless attention. So it means, and the philosophy behind this is that the more that you practice a kind of surrendering, and so the other aspect of centering prayer is you say like a sacred word, right? It has to be like one syllable. So like Amen, Jesus, God, love, etc. Um, love, I mean, love's not maybe like a sacred word, but they talk about something that like it can open you up to surrendering the the thoughts instead of becoming invested in them. So basically, anytime you get invested in a noise or a thought or a certain feeling, you find your attention being gathered somewhere, you say the sacred word and it releases you from that attention. And so in some sense it should be more like, not like a suffocating of thoughts, but more like a kind of releasement of your investment towards them. Um, so in that sense, the only attention that is actually gathered is in not going back to like some one pointed attention, but your attention is more about on the releasement, right? That's where your attention is gathered in the act of the centering prayer. And the practice of the centering prayer is that you do this meditative prayer, twice a day. I've been kind of sloppy with it, but I at least do it once a day at the very least. But I try mostly to do it twice a day. It's hard with like my work and stuff sometimes, especially like to try to do it in the morning. It can be hard. On days off, it's easier to do twice a day. But what I've noticed is that, and this is interesting because when I used to meditate, when I used to do Buddhist meditation, I didn't have much unloading of the unconscious as I do in centering prayer, which is insane to me. I do think Buddhist meditation can unload the unconscious for people, but I remember when I used to meditate for a long time, I used to never have so much memories just bursting through. And so what I've noticed is that when I am in this silence of the centering prayer, is that my unconscious, after a while, if you do it, this prayer for a while, your unconscious starts unloading and you start having memories, like memories that I don't think I ever could have conjured if I just didn't sit in silence for 20 minutes. Um, and it made me think about why silence is like so unbearable. Silence is utterly so unbearable in many ways. I've become more like hyper aware of like my distaste and at the same time yearning for silence. But I've also learned that I have a sort of limited capacity for silence. Like I can only go for so long before I just want it to break. I want the silence to break. And so this is a really interesting point of understanding myself, is my capacity for silence. Um, and so I've been trying to cultivate more, just trying to have as any time in my day, just trying to have some moments of silence, and if possible, in that hope, I hope that I can extend my capacity for silence. I'm very doubtful about um, being able to do it on my own. This is the Christian sentiment of like God's grace, sort of coming in. So I try not to preoccupy my concern with that too much. So that's kind of the segment on silence. The other idea is I started thinking about suffering and pain. And suffering and pain have a very fascinating uh, position. And something that I noticed about pain in particular is that it's always yours. You can share your pain. You can speak about your pain. Psychoanalysis is very much about trying to get you to speak about your pain and trying to understand how you relate to your pain. But what I find in particular very unique about pain is that it's always, in some sense, in the Christian sense, your cross to bear, which is quite fascinating, maybe in a horrible way. It's always your cross to bear for some reason. Um, and it's stunning actually, because no matter what someone does to you, No matter what they say or do, um, there's nothing that can be done to uh, eradicate the possession of that pain that is yours. In many ways, and I think Nietzsche does a really good at making this point. When we come up with the ideas of punitive and moral consequences and the idea of justice, retribution, all this other stuff, is that we try to give a equivalence to pain. We try to give an equivalence to the pain caused, to the loss suffered, to the suffering that was given. I recently was in an accident. This was like, well, not too recently. I think it's been about a month now. Um, and this idea of like the insurance, tries to pay me for my bodily injuries and the damages in my car. So there's still a payment, a equivalence of for pain. But what's interesting is that it does not get rid of the pain per se. You could say it only, kind of, you know, I don't even know how to explain it. It seems that I think for some people it might alleviate some of the pain, right? Um, because in some sense, if we believe that we're causing pain in return, um, which we might call justice, uh, as a kind of equivalence, as a kind of compensation that could help us go forward with our pain. But the problem is, and the problem still remains, is that our pain is still our pain. I think that's the real issue, unfortunately. And you still have to deal with your pain. You still have to own your pain to a degree. But I've also been thinking about how we have really horrible ways of owning our pain. One is, the more common one, which is there is a cause. We focus on the cause of our pain. So that kind of distracts us from dealing with our pain, because in some ways we think that if we punish the cause of our pain, if we can somehow blame the cause of our pain, we can that is us dealing with the pain. That is us somehow resolving the pain. This is the same logic with self blame, um, self punishment, or self deprecation. If you identify yourself as the origin of your pain and accuse yourself and punish yourself as the one that is cause of your pain, um, in some ways you're still not dealing with your pain. And we might be fully convinced of this, but it's what is the same to self blame and blame of others is a way to distance ourselves from the dealing of our pain, which of course is at the same time we're always very convinced that if we accuse ourselves of the cause of our pain or accuse others as the cause of our pain, um, this is somehow dealing with the pain. But actually, dealing with the pain is very odd and different. And what does that mean? It means that there is perhaps, even though there might perhaps be people to blame, blaming alone and the self-deprecation alone, or perhaps the more punitive dealing with pain alone, is not enough to actually deal with pain. If anything, they are at best byproducts of pain itself. Um, and so dealing with pain, I think, comes to a very radical conclusion of understanding that it is your own, and that it does not help to, in this case, it does not help to pinpoint a source of that pain, um, because it does not help you deal with the pain in many ways. And so dealing with the pain seems to amount to facing the pain without fixating on the origin or cause of it. And what does that look like? It can be debatable for all of us. But I think in the more Christian, contemplative paradigm, the more mystic, saintly paradigm, it has to do with releasement, surrendering, abiding. And this is why I was talking about silence. It's like there's a certain degree of silence. After a while, silence can be painful, and we all have different capacities for silence. But after a while, silence can become painful, because if there's enough silence, if you let enough silence happen, pain starts emerging. That's what I've noticed. Pain starts emerging. Your thoughts start wandering. Memories start surfacing. Memories long forgotten start surfacing. Memories that perhaps you have never even thought you had. Memories you've completely even forgot about. They start emerging. And so in silence, there's pain after a while. And all you can do in silence is simply abide in them. And that seems to be the only way to deal with pain in a way of facing them, I would say. And so that's a very interesting idea, because you understand that we do a lot of talking. We do a lot of talking, as I'm doing now. We do a lot of talking, and it seems even contrary to psychoanalysis. It's funny because there's a degree of psychoanalysis, I would say, that is trying to be attentive to a particular silence. It's funny because psychoanalysis is paying attention to what is not being said, basically. What is not being said? This is why we're deceptive subjects. We're deceptive beings when we're talking to ourselves, when we're talking to each other. We have a sort of natural, we have an inclination to be deceptive without really trying to purposely be deceptive, mainly because of our ego resistances. But in silence, it really, really starts to come out. Because if you just sit there long enough, the unconscious starts to unload, and you really start to get uncomfortable. And you really start to not want to be around, or you really start getting the urge to talk, to say something, or perhaps even to think. You get the urge to think. um, but I think abiding, the way of facing silence is a way of, of dealing with pain, because if you can increase your capacity for silence, you can increase, perhaps you can increase your capacity for dealing with pain and suffering without necessarily fixating on the origins or cause of our suffering and pain. I think fixating on the origin or causes of our pain can be more or less a distraction from actually dealing with our pain. Um, so this is an interesting remark, I would say, a kind of interesting reflection that I've kind of been slowly dwelling on and in about. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with letting the pain be, essentially, and refraining your, refraining, right? Refraining yourself or deferring yourself from trying to distract yourself away from it, you know, instead of, trying to look for a cause or an explanation. In many ways, I think psychoanalysis kind of helps with this. You can kind of see how it helps. But I think even the old theological traditions of meditative prayer, and you start thinking about St. John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul kind of thing, like actually focusing on God, focusing on the silence. And many saints, many saints and mystics talk about, if you just tune in to the silence, that's your abiding presence in God. It's not necessarily always a joyous and wonderful journey, um, because what is struggling there, this is what the mystics and contemplatives kind of point to us, what is struggling there is the self is constantly refusing to detach itself from its desires, from its obsessions. It's not wanting to give up, essentially. I think a lot about prayer and meditation and whatever your religion you decide to go with, as long as there's some praxis in silence. As long as there's some praxis in silence, I think all religions that have to do with that understand why mere creeds or mere beliefs or mere dogmas are really not enough to understand what we're actually talking about. It seems that when we're in silence in relation to theological beliefs, only do we actually begin to understand what might actually be being said about God and being and love and forgiveness and compassion and all that stuff. And what it means also to understand that perhaps we have a very limited capacity for silence as well as dealing with our pain. But all right, that's enough from me. All right, guys, take care.